In this video, I want to talk about two different types of forced migration, refugees and internally displaced people. Both have very specific definitions and different rights under international law. So, how does international law define refugees? The 1951 Convention, the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, defines a refugee as a person who, owing to a well founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality. So that's the official definition according to the 1951 Convention, which is the most influential codification of international law related to refugees. And there's a couple of things specifically to take note in this specific definition because they're going to be important for understanding the refugee flows that we're going to be looking at today and later on this semester. So, first, is there's a well-founded fear of persecution. That well-founded fear indicates that there's the fear has to be at the individual level, the person who is fearing persecution, as well as some judgment about whether that fear is well-founded. So it's both an internal motivation by a specific person seeking to leave their country in order to get protection, as well as some judgment by international actors that that fear was justifiable. And it is a fear due to a couple of memberships of a couple of different groups. Race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group or political of opinion. So this, in similar ways to the international definition of genocide, involves the targeting of individuals by the government, in this case, within their country of origin, because of membership of some group or opinions that they hold that they fear that they're going to be prosecuted for having. The other crucial thing to note about this is that the person has to be outside their country of origin. And this is important in the definition of refugees and how it's different than IDPs, because refugees have actually crossed an international border and internally displaced people have not. And people who are actually on the other side of an international border and are able to get refugee status, they are protected by a concept of non-refoulement, which is basically that you can't. They are protected from being repatriated to their own country. Because of the consequences that they would face if they were actually returned. And so once people actually get across the border, we're going to touch on this in later weeks, looking at domestic and international responses to climate and human security and conflict challenges. The first one is that people decide to return home in some of the conflicts that we're going to look at. Once the conflicts actually end, people do want to return home to their to where they're from. Usually, in the first instance, I remember in the aftermath of the Afghanistan war in 2001, there was a huge proportion of Afghans that had been living in Pakistan for decades, and after the government change, some proportion of those people decided to move back home. When after I went over the border from Rwanda to Tanzania, I saw some former refugee camps in Tanzania. There were still people there on the other side of the border, but a large part of the people, proportion of people who had been abroad in Tanzania after 1994 had voluntarily returned home once they judged that it was safe to be able to do so. And so I think there's a lot of international and domestic and individual reasons for people wanting to return home voluntarily, and so that's usually the first instance of what support organizations are looking to do. The second would be local integration. If refugees are resettled, they can decide that they've put down roots there and gradually integrate into the destination society. The third is third country resettlement. I don't know how closely you've been following recent international refugee policies, but Australia has made some decisions about some of the refugees or people, asylum seekers that had been trying to reach Australia. They'd ended up being resettled abroad. But this non-refoulement, nobody under international law has the right to force someone to return to their home country if they have that well-founded fear and have been categorized as a refugee. And so this is an article that I came across in International Refugee Law Journal that suggests that non-refoulement, and there's a lot of literature on this, is basically one of those fundamental concepts and norms in international law in which you really can derivate from it. Some countries might feel pressure by domestic populations to try to move people or to not have them stay in a particular place, but it is not legal under international law for people to be forced to return to their home if they do have that well-founded fear of prosecution. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people are resettled to a third country for long-term local integration or until people feel it's safe to return home. A recent example of this, even during the COVID-19 crisis, Australia and the US had struck an earlier deal to resettle some asylum seekers that had been on Australian territory to the United States. And so the US resettled several dozen. The Trump administration had pushed back briefly against this agreement, but they ended up going through with it and accepting some asylum seekers and refugees to third-party resettlement. So a couple of brief statistics to give you an idea of the size and scope of refugee flows, and then we're going to get into internally displaced people. Almost 80 million people were forcibly displaced at the end of 2019. As with the previous video, a lot of these statistics are taken from either the International Organization of Migration or the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is the UN's main refugee agency. Most of the people, as you'll see from this, are internally displaced, 45.7 million, while 26 million are refugees. And then you have 4.2 million people who are seeking to become classified as refugees, because once you make it across the border, you have to provide evidence that you are seeking asylum for legitimate fears of persecution, and then you can be granted refugee status. Often that can take a while to actually be processed. So the majority of people who are displaced within their own country. It can take a long time to be forcibly categorized as a refugee. Where do a lot of these refugees go? By and large, most of the refugees that make it outside the country's borders in which they're from, they usually make it to neighboring countries. And most of those neighboring countries are developing or least developed countries, because a lot of refugees are fleeing conflicts. And as we've learned in this class, most of those are less democratic and less economically developed countries. Developing countries, as of 2015, the latest year I was able to get data, host over 12 million refugees. Least developed countries host over 3.6. Over 2/3 of, so you see the top 5 countries in which the number where refugees are hosted. Turkey's number 1 at 3.6, Colombia 1.8, Pakistan 1.4, Uganda the same, and Germany 1.1. The interesting thing about teaching this class for a couple years is I get to follow the data year on year as I teach the class again. And what's really remarkable is how the number of refugees has increased, as well as the countries that drop in and drop out of the largest refugee flows. Unlike some of the statistics and countries that we've looked at so far in this class, these data can change more quickly than political institutions, economic development, other indicators that we've looked at so far in this class. So Turkey, just since last year, over it has over doubled the number of official refugees within Turkish territory. Colombia wasn't even in the top five last year, but because of the huge number of Venezuelans fleeing the country for reasons that we've already touched on in this class, 1.8 million refugees have now flowed over the border into Colombia. Pakistan stayed relatively constant. Uganda has climbed at least 300,000 people from last year, in large part due to the instability in neighboring South Sudan. Germany also wasn't in the top five, but they've tried to set an inclusive policy and accepted more people than in sheer numbers than other European countries. Where do these refugees come from? They come from states that have ongoing conflict or instability. Syria, the numbers keep on climbing every year. I teach this class 6.6 million. In the end of 2019, more than half just came from 3 countries in 2015. As of the end of 2019, 2/3 of all refugees come from just these top 5 countries. Venezuela, 3.7 million, Afghanistan, 2.6, South Sudan, 2.2, and Myanmar, 1.1. Again, Myanmar wasn't on there until recently. I was actually in Myanmar monitoring the 2015 election, in which there was a lot of raised expectations about the military loosening their grip on power and devolving some power to the Democratic opposition. Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi was going to be not the president, but the de facto president because of restrictions on who could run. But since then, with the Rohingya crisis and people fleeing into Thailand, but mostly into Bangladesh, the number of refugees from Myanmar has climbed quite dramatically just in the last couple of years that I've been teaching this class, and it's really remarkable the trajectory that these countries can take. Expectations can change quite dramatically over time. Refugees as a share of world population is actually not as high as a percentage of population now as it has been in the past. The sheer number of forcibly displaced people is almost 80 million. That's more than as an absolute number over time, but as a percentage of the population, as we mentioned before, more and more people are being born. It is not quite as high. After the end of the Cold War, you actually did see, with the increased instability and political change after the end of the Cold War, you actually saw a quite remarkable spike in the last years of the Cold War and the first couple of years afterwards. So there's a lot of different ways of trying to get at the nature and the trajectory of refugee flows. I know some of you are writing papers on it. This is another graph. I made this graph myself. What I wanted to do here is to point out the disparity between the overall number of refugees, the blue line here, and the red line of asylum seekers. So there's a lot of people who apply for refugee status and are rejected, and those can take a long time, and people can spend decades with refugee status once they actually receive it. So the number of people applying are substantially less than the millions of people who actually do qualify as refugees. I also downloaded the data from UNHCR to kind of see where Australia stood, and you see this influx after the Vietnam War in the late 1970s and early 80s, and you see a much smaller gap between the number of refugees and asylum seekers leading up to 2015. Of course, there has been policy changes in some ways since 2015, but you do see this ebb and flow in a number of different countries. So these flows can change quite quickly. Where they come from and where they go to can change quite quickly. The first couple years that I was teaching this class, I talked about the examples of refugees fleeing from Iraq and Syria. Now Venezuela is one of those areas that isn't covered as much, but has larger numbers. But you see here the Syrian case that we're going to look at later on, that huge growth from pretty much zero in 2011 to over almost was it 6.6 million people last year. So other countries can enter quite quickly and leave, while you see Afghanistan as relatively constant number. Where they go to has changed. A lot of the Syrian refugees have actually gone to Turkey. Syria, before the conflict, actually hosted a number of refugees from neighboring Iraq. So there's a lot of changes about this over time, and Germany has increased as well. So changes, where they are, and the countries that they go to are developing, like Uganda or Sudan, that don't have necessarily the resources to be able to provide for these people, and the funding requests for some of these locations are not fully funded. I mentioned the European case from a couple of years ago. We still see coverage of that sometimes in the international media, but in 2015, over 1 million people traveled to Europe from a number of different directions, from Northern Africa directly across, or through Turkey and then over. And the European Union has made a different types of policies related to refugees in recent years, after agreements with Turkey to stop the flow. In recent years, those numbers have slowed down quite dramatically, and you see the people actually being based, refugees living in Turkey, often with international support, because there was discussion in Europe that it's cheaper and more desirable to try to keep people close to their home country, to not overwhelm countries that they might not have the political will to accept people, as well as after the end of the conflict, hopefully people will be able to return to their own countries. This migration process is dangerous and uncertain. Hopefully you saw with the Darien Gap videos before this video, these treacherous journeys might not get a lot of international attention, but even in 2020, people are undertaking incredibly treacherous journeys to be able to look for a better life for themselves and for their children. Unfortunately, there's been a couple of high-profile cases in the Mediterranean of young people dying, and just in the last week there was a boat in which you had a couple of dozen people disappear. So people are still regularly dying. You can see in this graph variation of the months in which when people go, that it can be more it was more popular to go during the summer months than in the winter months, but there has been regular efforts to try to flee, and that has a chance of fatalities regardless of the month that you go. Where these migrant deaths are, by and large, in recent years, it's been disproportionately in the Mediterranean, although you do see over 1,400 people just dying in Africa from attempts to migrate, often making the journey north to northern Africa. And you see that initial peak in 2015, 2016, and it has declined in recent years, but it hasn't declined all the way to zero. The number of people, once you actually make it over the border, that you can apply for asylum, you saw that bulge in the number of deaths. You see the same thing with asylum applications in 2015 and 2016. Some people's cases can take months, as you saw with the people just trying to move north from Panama. And different countries have very different policies about whether they should take asylum seekers or not, or refugees. This is a graph from EU asylum applications from 2018, the most recent year that I could get from the European Union, and just notice the difference in the acceptance rates of Ireland and Switzerland. Ireland, the acceptance rate was above 50%. Switzerland, it was almost 40% that received refugee status, and you see above that they can get additional protections for humanitarian reasons or otherwise, while you have other countries like Poland and the Czech Republic that reject almost 90% of people who apply for refugee status within their country. So another one of those ongoing themes that we've had in this course, in that you have different kinds of challenges for political systems, and different types of governments or leaders make very different decisions about similar kind of challenges than a lot of countries face, for reasons that you can look at in your own papers, or that we're going to look at a bit later, for what the characteristics of states are, and that's kind of linking migration and conflict. One of those kind of responses is just to try to build that wall. Bulgaria in 2014 built a fence on their borders with Greece and Turkey as a way to try to stop people from trying to cross their territory. Most of the migrants were not actually planning on stopping in Bulgaria. They were trying to head north, but there was local domestic pressure, as well as it was kind of a bottleneck to the rest of Europe to try to crack down on people stopping. And once you get those kind of barriers, it has a national level effect on not having people migrating into often developed countries, but it also has a policy effect on the people who aren't able to actually cross borders. There's just a map of Bulgaria there. You can see how they were a major kind of transit point north through the rest of Europe. So what happens to people if they can't cross those borders? They're officially considered an internally displaced person. Here's a definition of an IDP. They stay within their own country and remain under the protection of their government, even if that government is the reason for their displacement. They often move to areas where it's difficult to deliver humanitarian assistance. As a result, these people are amongst the most vulnerable in the world. This is from the UN HCR. The crucial difference between refugees and IDPs is that IDPs don't make it across that border, and so they don't have those rights to non-refoulement. The government still has official obligation to protect those people, and they fall under the laws of their own country. And you can see just within the last 6 months, this map, there's a lot of people who have been displaced, often for conflict, but sometimes for natural disasters, the kinds we're going to talk about later on in this semester. And at the end of 2019, some 45 million people were displaced, as I mentioned before, within their own country. Not more people displaced within their own country as opposed to across. These are the top countries due to conflict relevant for this class. Syria, of course, being the largest. Congo, not really on those list of the top international sources for refugees, because a lot of people are displaced within their country. Almost as many people that are in Syria, but you don't hear as much about Congo, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso as you do with some of the other countries. And there are also some that are displaced by natural disasters, which we're going to focus on later. But you see here the largest number of people, over 2.5 million people, were displaced in the horrible monsoon flooding in India, Bangladesh, due to storms, China, India. You see a lot of these natural disasters that can lead to quite large and quite short-term flows of people trying to reach security. So that's a brief kind of overview of the definitions of two types of forced migration: refugees and internally displaced people. And in the next section, I want to talk about environmental refugees. Less clear-cut definition, less clear-cut rights and establishment under international law, but one that's definitely relevant to this class.